Welcome back here at Goldberg. Today we'll be talking about the costs of life. I know that's a very strange title. As you know, the Supreme Court ruled on Roe v. Wade. People were saying it's a anti-abortion, like it's an abortion ban ruling. Not exactly. It just in a very conservative manner, because they are conservative in their conservatism. They empowered the states to restrict abortion rights. They didn't go out and legislate and say that at the moment of conception it's a child, therefore nationwide it has to be banned. Perhaps that will be forthcoming in the future, but I'm not certain, as it might potentially lead to demands for the creation of a federal abortion police, which would just be a nightmare of epic proportions. That being said, it does illustrate the rather schizophrenic nature of the American right wing, because if you're a conservative historically, you are protecting an established order, a hierarchy. That's why you're going to be rather restrictive on how many rights you expand. If you look at it up until, let's say, the 1960s, the conception of America was largely on limiting how much more would be delivered in terms of expansion of government. Obviously, FDR was trying to put a test to that. But it's really after the 1960s that you get this extremely invasive federal government that has to secure or just create new rights out of thin air. What happened to conservatives, however, is that as much as they are these sort of old guard institutionalists, protect the republic, which, contrary to what Dinesh D'Souza will tell you, America was founded as a limited land-owning aristocratic model, right? I mean, not that you have no ability to rise up, but it was not intended to be equalitarian. However, the influence of classical liberalism and, of course, modern Christianity, which is highly equalitarian in nature, at least in the mainstream variations, and I include classical liberalism. I know that classical liberals say there is going to be a hierarchy, there's not perfect equality, it's just, essentially what the person can do. But in effect, especially with the Christian arguments, everyone's a child of God. You have to be always fixated on, oh, this person is valuable too, even if that person could potentially be a future threat to your traditional system that you want to defend. Some are saying this will create a more trad moral society because there will be less abortions. And what I've noted in the past is that it's hard to justify abortion from an ethical standpoint unless you make the fetus less of a human being. But that's also where the individualism creates a problem, because you say, is the individualism and those rights applied to the woman? Does she not have autonomy over her womb specifically? Are they one and the same, her and the baby, because the baby is dependent on her? It's not an easy fix when you really break it down philosophically. But that being said, our belief that perhaps this would create more of a trad environment is rather belied by history itself. So you can go back to, for instance, China. You know that women, if they didn't have food, they would smother kids. That was not exactly uncommon. But let's say Europe in the 1800s. You have the slow growth of industrialization, which really picks up in the 1800s. More women are moving to cities and getting jobs. They don't have necessarily a family support structure. And this is at a time when the average person's a lot more religious, a lot more trad in their mindset than you're going to see nowadays. Well, these girls would still hook up with soldiers or even rich men who would then say, well, I'm not having anything to do with you because I'm marrying someone from my class. And abortion, there were no doubt some abortions that happened in a crude fashion, but a lot of women were having kids and they couldn't support them. They didn't have necessarily daycare or the family structure, so those kids were being dropped off at churches. And this is where you see the rise of like the orphanage system, the poorhouses, which were in many cases run by the church, but the church and the governments were closely intertwined. So look at some of the most prominent works of European literature. Les Miserables, what did that start with? Essentially a woman with a kid that she couldn't take care of, and she's very poor. And she's trying to find the person who can adopt this child at some level. David Copperfield, obviously Oliver Twist. He's in this abusive orphanage. They're all eating gruel, and they see the high up officials with their delicious feast. The impotence of them saying, "How dare you ask for more food?" Now, the boys that are not in the appropriate state structure, where are they? They are living under the auspices of the kindly care bearer Fagin. You know, take a tip from Bill Sykes, he can nip what he likes. Charity's fine, subscribe to mine, and get out and pick a pocket or two. So this is not exactly a illustrious portrayal of a society where you have less abortion overall. In fact, Dickens himself had experiences with his family being in a poorhouse, him having to labor in a crappy factory. The response to that environment and the treatment of children was eventually the Factory Acts, the liberal reform movement, compulsory public education, banning children from working in certain industries. So a conservative Traddist model actually gave birth to this more liberal one, and of course eventually you had the Labor Party. So I'm not entirely certain if the outcome of this, anything goes, is necessarily positive. You might argue that abortion is an immoral thing, but the fact that it exists at some level helps as a control mechanism for society. And I know it sounds really effed up, but we can't just ignore it because, it doesn't fit our nice little fancy political and religious viewpoints. This leads to another question of who exactly is having the abortions. Now, I know you guys see on Twitter, I'm proud of my abortion, and it's some Care Bear woman or some liberal arts major, Becky. I get that, and it does happen. But if you really look at it, the overwhelming number of abortions, who is exactly pursuing them? Let's be real for a second. The poorest 12% of women account for almost 50% of abortions, and the poorest 30% for 75% of abortions. So usually women are saying they're going for abortions because they don't have financial resources, or alternatively, maybe it's a matter of inconvenience, like, I don't want to have a kid, or it's a political statement. Okay. If they don't have financial resources, higher likelihood the kid is going to be raised in a low-income community like Section 8, exposed to drugs, violence, whatever. A very traditional religious standpoint typically holds that if a child dies as a baby, when they're not really able to understand, salvation, accepting God, accepting Jesus, that would mean that that child is going to go to heaven automatically. So is it better that that child is born and exposed to the potential of them becoming a criminal, a drug addict, maybe causing harm to themselves or others, or they just don't actually get to that point? It's still screwed up, but it's a question you have to address. Now, if the mother is having the kids not going to have the kids because, I don't care, I'm a liberal, think about what that says about her genetics. Should someone like that be having a kid, period? I said this years ago. Probably the most reasonable compromise is you can have an abortion, but if you do so, you're not going to be a parent in the future. And that's going to be insured on the basis of you having that abortion. And I extend it to men as well, because I know a lot of these guys like to think men are old trad. There's a lot of dudes who are very, gung-ho about the girlfriend getting an abortion if they just don't care about having a kid, right? Or maybe he was banging this chick, pleasure, no condom, but he had no intention of ever actually being with her long term. So yeah, there should be consequences. You're going to get your things tied. He's going to get a vasectomy so that we're not propagating bad genes. And again, I know this is very controversial because you can't say it, but this is essentially, abortion is basically voluntary eugenics. But you say the word genetics and people just see red because I guess they associate that with, you mean I shouldn't be reproducing? Well, that's up to you. It would be up to you unless it's completely banned. So these are complicated questions that your typical pro-lifer will never address because it doesn't fit in the initial moral victory, which is less abortion, but then you don't consider the consequences long term. Maybe it's one of those things that is bad, but it's better overall that it exists, at least at some level. Now, if we take a look over here, I kind of enjoyed this quote: "Nothing gets Christians more excited than bringing new souls into existence. The quality of those souls, however, is rarely given consideration." Exactly. If you have the offspring, not that they all support, blocking abortion in those cases, but you have the offspring of a rapist, are they propagating bad genes? I know no one wants to hear this whole discussion, but it is very significant. Sure, you're going to have occasionally out of the low-income black population, you'll have a Clarence Thomas, or you'll have J.D. Vance, who stopped drinking Mountain Dew, went to law school, and married an intelligent Pooja. But a lot of people won't. And now you can say, yeah, but there will be adoptions. How many people really want to adopt a crack baby? Now, I was talking to this guy. He said, I know tons of successful crack babies. I'm like, right, absolutely. There was a whole case with Russia where Americans were putting the children back on planes and sending them to Russia. That's why Putin banned adoptions, because a lot of these Russian kids come from families with alcohol issues, drug issues, and they have developmental problems, which are difficult to deal with unless you're going to spend the money on special needs courses, which are very costly, by the way, outside of public schools at least. And many public schools don't even have those services. So it's a lot more complicated than just, oh yeah, they get born and someone adopts them. I mean, there's going to be certain people that will, but it's a far more complex issue than you're letting out. I believe that many of these folks, they take that initial moral high, if you will, because they're trying to make a political statement and they're trying to make themselves look good. Here is a perfect example. Okay, a couple of clowns. We have the contrarian liberal Ricardo Spencerito, and we have Sticks down here. All right, everyone. A massively disproportionate number of U.S. abortions occur among black women, almost 40% actually. This is a typical boomer claim to make. And it's like, dude, you grew up in one of the whitest states in the country. What the hell do you have in common with black people, let alone black women? Nothing. You're literally just putting out a boomer, Dinesh D'Souza talking point to try to... I've said this before. In the United States, being or claiming to be on the side of black people, it's almost like the mandate of heaven or the mandate of Tyrone. Like, you have to maintain this. Everything you do has to be justified on the basis of black people. It's like, dude, leave them alone. They can make their own decisions. And yeah, you know what? If a black woman chooses to have an abortion because she doesn't feel she has enough money, or maybe whatever, she is one of those political harpy types, do you really want them to reproduce? And I say this for any group of people, any person who has that approach. Do you really want them to have kids? It's a brutal thing to even discuss, but that's the realist, mature perspective. That's not the, oh, morality. Morality, it's harsh to say this, but there are people who probably should not be reproducing. And when you eliminate the means of them doing that, what is going to be the result? This is strange too, because conservatives are big into like, we got to roll back welfare, all this stuff. That'll be a big lift, by the way, rolling back welfare, much bigger than abortion. But it's like you're creating the conditions where more people will become dependents. Probably worse than that, you're creating a larger population that on average, regardless of where they're coming from, they're not going to have the civic understanding to protect the old Republican model. They're more likely to be the types that are going to be Bernie Booty Boy supporters, ultimately. Again, regardless of background, because you come from a certain region, you have a broken family, you're going to be more like, oh, the government should save me, the government should do this, or I'm living off of the government. So that's my point. I oppose abortion. I don't think that it's a good thing, but in a weird, paradoxical manner, its existence on some level probably does good for society as a whole, as far as a degenerate state is concerned. Now, maybe you claim, oh, if you become trad, when are we going to become trad? Like, when is that realistically going to happen beyond people's wildest dreams? Maybe in small communities, but I don't think the entire United States is heading in that direction anytime soon. So let me know, what you think. No abortion whatsoever, some abortion, free, open access to abortion. What is your opinion and what's your justification?